Mr. Big Voice there doing an introduction for me this morning. It may pop up any time, but in the meantime, I don't much care for dead air. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And I want to thank you for joining us this morning. It was a lovely weekend, I'm sure, for most all of you, and one of those types of weekends where you just sat back, enjoyed the cold. All right, maybe not so much, but you got a lot done. Perhaps around the house because it stayed relatively dry. Weather looking up toward the end of the week. By the weekend, we could be looking at temperatures around 60 degrees again. So that Indian spring we had a few weeks ago could be returning sometime in just a matter of a few days. Chilly out this morning. We start the program off at 21 at our studios, 7 minutes after 8 o'clock, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. I have a lot of things to talk about today. I have a couple of guests joining us as well. One will be along. Oh, golly, about 8:40 this morning, Randy Staples will join us from the Idaho Weekly Briefing, and we'll be talking about just some events going on around the state, political events, maybe some other types of events. Also, a concern that may come up, and it may come up soon, about the potential for wildfires across the Northwest and really across much of the Mountain Time Zone and some of the Pacific Time Zone as well because of some of the dry conditions in some spots, albeit Idaho not quite as dry as some of our neighboring states. Chris Anderson scheduled to join us as well a little bit later this morning. We'll be talking about, just some things going on at the planetarium and museum over at the campus of College of Southern Idaho. Chris joins us about once a month and briefs us on some of the things that are going on in his world as well. And his world includes many other worlds, as many of you know. Also today, I wanted to speak just ever so briefly, if I could, about something I happened to see while doing my work prep over the weekend. And that was, that means I have to actually sit down and occasionally read some of these terrible newspapers, especially with the op-ed pages. You notice that all of the liberal writers are the local people. Just to get a conservative voice in some of these papers, they either bring you a syndicated guy out of Washington or once in a while a talk show host out of Idaho Falls. He must be related to somebody on the local level. But I happen to find this in the Sunday Times News. And I've actually, if you can see this, if you're looking at the, later today, some of you may be looking at the podcast. If you happen to see this at the time, let me just explain to you very, very quickly that if you come across this, all I'm going to tell you is this at the moment. There are people out there in politics, especially on the American left, who believe that the rest of you would join them if they could only convince you and bring you out of your right-wing stupor and convince you that voting for Lefty was good for you because Lefty will play Santa Claus every day. Don't worry about the money. We'll just print more or borrow more from China or from the sovereign wealth funds from some of the Islamic republics around the world. All of these things which currently fund all of our government programs because taxes just simply don't do the trick. There is a new chairman, or chairwoman, we should say, of the Democrat Party in Twin Falls, Idaho. That is Twin Falls County. Her name is Linda, and I guess it's pronounced Brugger. She had a guest commentary in the Times News yesterday. It was not easy to find. First of all, let me bring that up, because the new editor of that newspaper had to spend 2 pages in the op-ed section explaining that he can't spell. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't instill a great deal of confidence in what the newspaper is publishing when the guy in charge says, hey, I can't string a word together. Yeah, okay. Thank you very, very, very much. It would be like me sitting here saying that, I just basically learned English a week ago and that I'm a lifelong stutterer, so please bear with me on talk radio. All right, now we're going to get calls from the lifelong stutterers saying their feelings are hurt. If that be the case, then take a Valium and go find something else to do with your life. But this Linda Brugger, I highlighted a couple of comments she happened to make. She said, there's ample evidence the one-party system in Boise's legislature has become a candy shop for outside corporate and billionaire interests. Yeah, because billionaires are constantly thinking, yeah, Idaho, you know what? That should be our next stop. She goes on to write, for example, the American Legislative Exchange Council, whatever that may be, and the Koch brothers. She says the Texas Koch brothers, but they're actually headquartered in Wichita, Kansas. Does she not know that, or is she geographically challenged? Wichita is in Kansas. Wichita is not in Texas, although there is a Wichita Falls in Texas. That's where the Dallas Cowboys train, but it is not Wichita, Kansas. And in fact, there is a state called Oklahoma that's a buffer between Kansas and Texas. So, speaking of people who can't spell, how about people who are geographically challenged? Yes, the evil Koch brothers are coming to Idaho, and they're going to take over the state and turn the rest of you into slave labor. They only employ in their own businesses, a couple of 100,000 people, which would say that they're among the best employers in the country if you go by just size and numbers involved with whatever business they happen to be involved with. The other thing is, when I always read the demonization of the Koch brothers, it's got nothing to do with what's going on really on the local level. It's just it's a convenient bogeyman for Lefty to constantly trot out. And so I mention that because I was working on a political campaign in another state last year, and all of the opposition coming from the liberal camp all dealt with Koch brothers, Koch brothers, Koch brothers, Koch brothers, Koch brothers. You couldn't go door to door without hearing people say Koch brothers. They didn't know who they were. They just heard it over and over and over again in TV advertising. So I would say Tom Steyer. Tom Steyer was the billionaire funding the liberal candidate we were running against, as well as liberal candidates all over the country. Or I'd say George Soros, and then people would just get angry. The lefties would slam their doors in my face because, Lord forbid, their own candidate be at the beck and call of his own billionaires. And then the woman goes on to write this. My priority, she says, is to educate Twin Falls voters to question authority when determining our state's future. So she does, because she's smart, smart, smart. You don't because you're dumb, dumb, dumb. So she has to educate you. I always hear this coming out of the mouths of lefties. Well, if we could only educate the public as to... See, their view is if they came up to you and said, hey, this small government stuff, you dumb, dumb, dummies just don't understand. Here's a whole bag of presents for you from Washington if you would only vote the liberal line. And they think that somehow if they just appeal to you by showing you what's inside the cookie jar or the big gift bag, that you'll say, wow, golly gee, I have been wrong all of my life. Thank you, Lefty, for saving me. I will now go down to the polls and vote for Democrats. It may well be that people in Idaho vote Republican in overwhelming numbers because they are sick of the entitlement culture, the gimme, 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 my Obama phone culture that we see being spewed by the left. So I just could not pass up that commentary this morning after having seen it in the newspaper yesterday and realizing once again, you have someone who believes she's the smartest person in any room that she walks into, and if you would only just listen, she could bring you to the liberal truth. A couple of other quick notes during the first segment of our program today. It's 8:14. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, along with newsradio1310.com. And our telephone number, 736-0300. That's 736-0300. And my email address, bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com, and the last name is spelled Colley, bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. I had an interesting email over the weekend from someone who does track what's going on in state government, and I'm talking really has his nose to the grindstone when it comes to keeping an eye on government and what's taking place. We had a conversation last week on air because Islam was introduced in some of our local schools, or at least one. They plant the seeds in these small ways. You understand that? Well, we're just being, ecumenical. And this is a way for children to learn about other cultures. Yeah, I'm sorry. We don't teach them enough about our own in the first place. Tomorrow, there is a fellow who is going to be opening the business at the state senate in Boise by doing a Hindu prayer. And I asked this question over the weekend after someone alerted me to it. Does that alarm anyone in the state of Idaho? Or should we just say, hey, you know what? There are some of these people who live amongst us. They should have an opportunity to go out and say the prayer. But the fellow who tipped me off got an email response from a member of the state senate who says this argument has been going on internally in the Senate since last summer, and that the individual who will be doing the prayer is not even a U.S. citizen, but approached them last summer and said, I would like to do the prayer, And it actually went to legal argument within the state. And the Senate was simply told, if you have Christian prayer from time to time to open a session, or Jewish prayer to open a session, then you have to allow everyone else to come in and actually say a prayer. So it's not that these people in office are looking to break down our Judeo-Christian heritage. It's just that by law, by statute, they apparently have no other choice, which means if people, and there are some people who, I read about this group a number of years ago, they worship mummified dogs. They kill the dogs, have them stuffed by a taxidermist, mummified, and then they put them into their temple, and they worship these mummified dogs. They are amongst us here in America. In fact, I think there are some of them who are actually operating out of Salt Lake City and Denver. But the U.S. Supreme Court actually shot them down when they wanted to put up a monument in a local park, basically having said in its ruling a few years ago that, yes, not all faiths are equal, and that people who go around stuffing dead dogs and claiming that they're worshiping them might have a screw loose. And for that reason, the court said take a hike. So perhaps if people felt strongly about an issue like this, because it won't be long before we have all of these other people who like to burn people at stake, make human offerings, or believe that if you go out and kill whales and slaughter the whales, you will therefore gain the favor of some sort of sea god. They will all be lining up to say prayer. And the only solution right now that we have is simply to eliminate prayer altogether in order to keep the kooks and the freaks out. I am not saying that Hindus are kooks and freaks. Believe me, I have no animosity toward them whatsoever. My roommate in graduate school when I was a young man happened to be Hindu and one of the nicest people I ever met. And he told me, he said, just like Christianity, you can find many, many schisms within Hinduism. And some people believe in multiple gods, but he pointed out too as well that in the early days of my faith, if you look at the book of Genesis, it mentions lesser gods. He said that many people like him believe ultimately in just one creator and then some lesser gods. And we used to have a lot of these conversations when we were young. And all I can tell you is he was one of the nicest people I ever met. And I was proud to call him a friend. And he couldn't wait to become an American citizen because he loved this country, especially going to Burger King. For some reason, going to Burger King to him was the ultimate in liberty and choice. And he would do it just about every day for his lunch. One day I said to him, what's the average caloric intake in your country? He said about 700 calories a day. I said, how many calories are in that Whopper? He said, about 700 calories. And I said, don't you feel guilty? He said, no. He said, I like the taste. Good answer. 20 minutes now after 8 o'clock. Don't let me get ahead of myself here. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX. Also anywhere around the world on newsradio1310.com. You can take us along anywhere you go. Listen to us online. Plenty coming up this morning. Randy Staples a little bit later will talk with us about some events going on around the state, political events too as well. And then we'll be talking a little bit about space with Chris Anderson coming up a bit later, right here on the radio this morning. At the moment that we speak, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, Benjamin is the English version of his first name, is speaking at something called AIPAC, that is the American-Israeli Political Action Committee. And of course, tomorrow he is going to be speaking, and not with the approval of President Barack Hussein Obama, to a joint session of Congress. Establishment media in this country, I could not find it this morning at the websites of the Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times. All of the big coastal liberal newspapers are not carrying the story, but you may have seen it over the weekend. It's being carried all over the world otherwise. Apparently last year, sometime in the spring or summer of last year, Israel had made a decision that it was going to attack Iranian nuclear facilities. And with that, President Obama got advice from Jimmy Carter's former national security advisor. And remember, it was Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who played that role for Carter, who screwed up this whole Iranian situation in the first place in the late 1970s. Brzezinski, who is also the father of the leftist Mika Brzezinski on MSDNC's Morning Joe advised President Obama shoot down Israeli planes if they try. So Mr. Obama's White House threatened Israel, saying, if you even attempt to bomb Iranian nuclear facilities, we are going to take out your Air Force. Being reported all over the world. It's not being reported, though, by establishment media in this country. They are avoiding that story. The rest of the world knows, and no one is. Here is one of the greatest American allies of the last half century, if not a little bit longer than that. And we are threatening to take out their Air Force because they are looking to protect themselves against a state which has said its goal is to wipe Israel off the map. Does not that tell you right now what type of individual Barack Hussein Obama is? He obviously hates two countries. You thought it was just the one that Rudolph Giuliani was talking about a couple of weeks ago. Well, now it's obvious there was another one in that situation. We'll talk more about this story tomorrow as Mr. Netanyahu speaks, of course, tomorrow before that joint session of Congress. But the more the American public knows about what's going on here, it would be better for the American public to make a decision, because it will tell you so much more that you need to know. Those people who've been sitting on the fence about Mr. Obama definitely need to know exactly what's been going on in the background. Do want to tell you this morning as well about a good friend of News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, and that is Western States Bus Services, where they're hiring part-time bus drivers right now. Split shifts, 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. To pay $10.75 an hour, you can apply today by contacting 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. We have a caller joining us this morning, and you can reach us at KLIX at 736-0300, and you're on the air. What's on your mind?
Well, I've been doing a little bit of research, and it seems to me that we use Palestine and Israel as pawns, or not we, I should say, the big money, the big power players in the world. And we've discovered that if we don't make nice with the Arabs, that all of the trade routes will be cut off. So that's what's going on here. That's what the president is doing. That's what the world powers are doing. And they're turning their back on Israel, and it's going to get them. That's just my opinion.
Well, when we mention trade routes, we're thinking mainly oil coming out of that part of the world. And now the United States could be, if we would finish this pipeline. Obviously, that's not going to happen in the next couple of years. We're not even going to get started on it because of a certain individual who's opposed. Even the Washington Post fact checker said Obama is lying through his teeth when he says that oil would not end up in this country that would come through that pipeline. But we are self-sufficient. We don't need Arab oil any longer.
You're absolutely right. But to give in to capitalism and freedom also takes control out of the big power hands. If we show as a people, like we have in the past, that capitalism is freedom and freedom is capitalism, and we break away from all this bureaucracy and everything, then that doesn't bode well for them either.
I think that we are looking at a situation here. The other point being that when they say they could block off trade routes, we could blow them out of the water. I think in the long run, well, at least for the time being, as we continually downsize the military, that's going to become less and less a possibility. But I was reading in some of the Israeli papers over the weekend some of the ridiculous things that Mr. Netanyahu was asked to accept. In other words, funding for his enemies, Hezbollah and some of these other terrorist organizations, and equal access to his country, open borders. These are types of things that he's tried to quietly compromise with, and now they're telling him he can't protect his own sovereign nation. I thank you for the telephone call. This is just abhorrent when you hear this, that this would happen. In fact, the argument was from Brzezinski to Obama, look, if they're going to bomb nuclear facilities in Iran, they have to fly over Iraqi airspace. So we'll just simply shoot their planes down as they do that. Again, I don't... Brzezinski himself, as I said, worked for Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. They were the people who allowed this whole Iranian mess to develop. And why anyone would go back and listen to those folks for advice. You're a demon if you do it, or you're possessed by a demon. That's all I can think of. We've got more coming up. 8:30, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com. I hope to be joined by Randy Staples in about 10 minutes once I find his telephone number again. If I could reflect for just another moment, these political action committees, which have a great deal of clout when it comes to government. Some of you may have been tracking what was taking place. They had a big conference conservatives did just outside Washington. I have a lot of friends who attend that every year. Funny thing is, I used to live about 2 hours away, and some of them used to ring me up while they were there from various parts of the country, and they'd say, come join us. And I always had a work commitment going on to where I could never attend the event. But I was watching it closely. There was broadcast live. They had a website set up, and if you couldn't watch it on C-SPAN, you could tune in and you could catch the thing, as I did over the weekend on the web. And I caught most of the speeches. I have to tell you though, I was really shocked when people said that Jeb Bush, all the mainstream media, and I wrote a column about this myself over the weekend. It's posted at our KLIX Facebook page as well. But I'm seeing other people mention the same thing. Why are the New York Times and the Washington Post saying Jeb Bush was brave to go there and did well while he was there? Well, he bussed in his supporters so they could drown out the booze. And when they say brave, it's not like they were going to throw bottles and rocks at him while he was speaking. But, of course, they're trying to set up a candidate that they want so they can knock that candidate over later on and give the general election to Queen Hillary Clinton. Of course, this is how it works. This is how the system works. So Jeb Bush did very, very well. Well, they didn't like his brother. They didn't like his dad. You know they don't like him deep down in. 8:35. Bill Colley with you this morning on News Radio 1310, KLIX, newsradio1310.com, 736-0300. We have another caller with us. And what's on your mind this morning?
Yeah, Bill, I hope I'm not covering something you already talked about, but, when Netanyahu is apparently not going to meet with the Democratic side of Congress that I know of, unless he's changed his mind, they are talking about how destructive this is and how divisive it was for Netanyahu, but then we have our administration and Biden and whoever else is representing us over there campaigning against Netanyahu in his own country. I could have swore that at the last election of Obama that Israel didn't have representatives over here campaigning against him. And so that is a point. And then one more thing, and I'll hang up. What is so baffling to me about the American Jewish community and even the European Jewish community, how they can ignore the reality that stares them in the face every day and somehow ignore it. So I'll hang up. Thanks.
I thank you. Well, and you had someone like Bill Nye appearing on Bill Maher's program on HBO, and Bill Nye was trying to run down this whole notion of Israel as a Jewish homeland. The elites in this country, and that includes the people who currently run the government, they do not believe, let's be honest about this, they do not believe that Israel has a legitimate claim to that land, a biblical claim, a historical claim. They just see it as it was a place they went after the Holocaust so they could try to bring the race back. That's how they look at it. On the other hand, if you're an observant Jew and you believe in that history and you believe that God, you are the chosen people, that is your land. These people who, it's the same thinking, though, that they have that somehow says that if we only gave young Arab Muslim men jobs, they wouldn't be violent. But they also believe in their religious faith in the same way. And we have people who can't see that because, well, they don't have any really serious religious convictions and they can't understand why anybody else would. So they make all of their decisions based upon that. It was fascinating reading some of the commentaries about CPAC over the weekend, because obviously the media does not like most of the people who happen to be there, candidates as well as attendees, and just did whatever it could to try to portray them as being somehow, well, as Chuck Schumer would say, out of the mainstream. as if somehow he is mainstream. Yeah, New York City communist. That really represents everybody in flyover country, doesn't it? But they tried to portray these people as somehow, being bats when you come right down to it, and just not getting with modernity, not getting with the program. Just the same way I read a story. If we get a chance, I want to talk about this a little later. A private college, Christian college, down in the deep south of this country is taking heat because it has reiterated its position that marriage is between a man and a woman, and in fact that all relations have to take place within marriage and between a man and a woman and not a man and a man or a woman and a woman or I don't know. And because of that, they are being challenged. In fact, they may lose their accreditation because of this. But they are a biblical college. This is what they believe. This is what they teach. And we are up against a group of people who are so sinister. I don't know that we can ever correct this. And the future of this country does truly hang in the balance. 840. Hopefully, and I say hopefully, I can get Randy Staples on the line in just a moment, and he'll join us this morning, chat with us about the Idaho Weekly Briefing. Otherwise, we'll have to do a reschedule on that. And my apologies to him if I can't track down this dang telephone number. Generally, about this time every week, what we do is we spend a few minutes with the publisher of Idaho Weekly Briefing. That is Randy Staples. And today I was a little concerned we might not be able to do that because my old-fashioned way of planning for a show, my little black book walked off somewhere around the building, and I'll still track it down. But luckily, if you actually go to Idaho Weekly Briefing, there is contact information there, and you can get a hold of the folks who are publishing that on a weekly basis. Randy joins us again this morning. It's 8:44:23 at our studios. First of all, welcome back. I'm glad you're here. Very glad, in fact.
Well, glad you were able to find it. It sounds as though the information served a new kind of purpose today.
Yes. Speaking of information, how big is you can't possibly be doing all of this on your own, or if you are, you've got a cape and a big S on your chest.
It's the internet is a wonderful thing. It allows for gathering a lot of information pretty efficiently. I do get some help, but we keep it fairly tight in terms of how we organize it and organize it pretty carefully.
I was going to say it's more than a 40-hour-a-week effort, though. Obviously,
it takes quite a few hours out of the week.
I would say so. And again, for people who'd like to take a look at it, a closer look at it, where would you send them?
Sure. I would go to www.ridenbaugh.com.
And again, to point out, Randy Staples is joining us this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, where you can hear us anywhere around the world. One thing I try to do when I'm doing the show is keep in mind the demographics of the people who are listening. And you have quite a discussion about Medicare in the publication this week, and of course some comments as well from Senator Mike Crapo, but some concerns going on there about some potential changes. Is that what I'm looking at?
Well, there's talk about how to make sure that Medicare Advantage doesn't wind up being disadvantaged in some of the health care changes and federal rule changes that go on ahead. Probably it's not going to be too much of a problem for very many people, but there's some possibilities of some cuts in Medicare Advantage that might hit some people, at least to some degree. Senator Mike Crapo has estimated that the individuals with disabilities could include as many as 70,000 Idahoans, and he's introducing some measures to try to ensure that these people aren't being hurt by the changes that are generally going on.
I was going to say just the demographics in the state this are going to trend an older population, and of course older folks are going to have even more of those disabilities. We all notice that as we grow older. You're not 17 and healthy forever, obviously.
Well, that's certainly true. And Idaho is very much susceptible to that. Idaho is as you point out, Idaho is trending a little bit older, and these kinds of things are having a little bit more of a disproportionate effect on Idaho.
The other really big story I see going on around the state, and you may concur with this, I've been reading more and more stories that imply that the federal government may well be looking at this whole broadband issue with the schools, and how this is all transpired and broken down. I think at the beginning there was some thought it could happen, but it looks like it could be becoming more and more likely to happen.
It appears very likely to happen. This is a case where federal money was at least originally involved, and the state was using federal money for contracting purposes that wound up being pretty questionable. And the feds do tend to go after cases like that. They go after cases very often where they can see local corruption, local or state corruption. They're looking into the situation over in Oregon as one example of that. But it would not be a surprise if it took that turn in Idaho as well. This is the whole broadband situation has gotten to be a very, very sticky situation for a lot of people in state government, and it's gotten very, very tough to get out of. In terms of the system going down immediately, the state's been spared that, but there are a lot of problems that are still associated with it, and are going to be for quite some time. And the feds may only be one part of it.
There are obviously people out there who think too that some decisions were made here that perhaps may have been made because someone was looking for a bit of an advantage for a political backer, etc. But on the other hand, the federal government, even if this was just simply incompetence or a mistake on somebody's part, the federal government isn't going to say, well, intent really doesn't matter. That's the part we have to keep in mind with all of this.
And that could very well be the case. What's being talked about now makes it a good deal worse, just because if you're talking about just incompetence, or just a matter of, well, something went wrong, you're right. That doesn't mean that the feds wouldn't get into it. That's entirely possible. But when you have allegations, at least, that things were deliberately mishandled, that there were intentional efforts to benefit some people, possibly for political reasons or other reasons, whatever they were, if they weren't the objectives of the state, then there would be a problem. The feds are very likely to get into it.
Two-pronged question. And a prediction from you. Do you see indictments? And number two, how high will those go if it happens?
I could imagine some indictment somewhere. It's very hard to know how high they would go. I could imagine something, for example, in the state agencies specifically that were contracting with it. But it's I think you have to wonder whether there may be something coming up a little bit higher than that into the level of people who are gubernatorial appointees, because they were the ones who, in large part, made the decisions back then. Now, it should be pointed out that generally, for the most part, those people aren't the same people who are in office right now. There's a new superintendent of public instruction. There's a new state administrator for Department of Administration, people who were most heavily overseeing this stuff directly. So we're not probably looking at the people who are in office right now, but more likely people, if something materialized, more likely people who were there at one time and are not now.
Our guest is Randy Staples. It's 8:51. He, of course, is the man behind the Idaho Weekly Briefing. 24 at our studios at the moment. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. The program is called Top Story with Bill Colley. You also had something on another topic about naturopathic medicine and people looking to clear the way. This has caught my attention right away because I was reading over the weekend about this dispute between National Review and PolitiFact, where some of the writers at National Review were saying that the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's known colloquially, that had that had actually opened the way for acupuncturists and the naturopathy, a lot of people who science may not necessarily back up, but that they are all included in this. Tom Harkin, I guess, was the individual who originally, when he was in the U.S. Senate, fought for that designation. But in Idaho, we may be seeing some restrictions lifted here to actually make it more, I guess, available to people to be licensed and then practice.
I remember years ago when naturopaths in Idaho came to the legislature, and this would be back in the early '80s, when naturopaths came to the Idaho legislature and asked for around a regime of regulation. They wanted to be regulated specifically so that they could be, in large part, so that they could be taken more seriously and have a real role at the table when it came to doing any kinds of medical care and participating in that system. And legislature made the decision to go ahead and regulate them. And so I think that may there may be some after effects of all that. That some of these decisions that were made by way of allowing people to have a formal regulatory stake in the state may wind up having some effect when it comes back around to cases like this. Are they going to be part of what people can do if they want to do it in terms of payments and insurance options under Obamacare? I think that's one of the issues that's probably going to be hammered out over the next year or two, and you may very well see, because there are different insurance exchanges, in many cases different insurance companies in the different states. There may be different answers to some of those questions in different states too.
One other thing that caught my attention too that you were writing about, you did a driving tour around the region, and you point out that it looks as if water situation, at least for spring planting in Idaho, is probably fine, but that we have been so dry over the last 6 to 8 weeks, things could be turning for the worse. And you even referenced the possibility of a lot of potential for forest fires, more forest fires in the Northwest this year.
There's I've heard some talk about that around the area. Traveling around, I was very much struck by a little snow I saw. I traveled through the Long Valley, which is the McCall and Cascade area, and I've been up in that area a number of times in February, and very often it can be tricky driving because there's typically ice on the road, and there's snow all over the place. You're seeing it's really kind of a winter wonderland kind of place, mostly through February. Early February is when they hold their winter carnival, which is a great event that they've had for many years. But now, this year, it is almost bone dry. There are a few small scraps of snow, even up on the mountains, looking up toward the top. You don't see consistent snow. It's pretty much in scraps, and that seems to be true almost everywhere around the Northwest that I drove.
I have a friend who works for a political action committee in California and was shocked last week when she posted on Facebook a prayer for rain and or snow, and ask other people to join in the prayer. And of course, it's critical there. We have not yet reached that proportion, but I guess if this were to continue, we could be seeing some water restrictions.
Hopefully, we don't get to that extent. California is in a really bad way in terms of water. It is very, very dry there. It's levels at places like Lake Shasta in Northern California that are down at low levels that people haven't seen in many years. And the state is projecting right now that in many places people may get only 10% of the water that they would ordinarily be allowed to get. I don't think we're going to be anywhere near that. We're not starting out from such a bad position, and California has been in drought condition now for several years, and the Northwest is not. So we're a lot better off than that. But I think that if people want to hope for rain, that would be a hope that would certainly not be ill-placed.
Yeah, and of course it's very water intensive in a place like the Magic Valley because, let's be honest, this area wasn't survivable at one point.
You're absolutely dependent on it. if there were not water, I mean, the Magic Valley 150 years ago was desert, period. And it's the import of substantial amounts of water is really what allows significant numbers of people to live there at all.
Randy Staples, I want to thank you again for your time this morning, and for people once more who'd like to look at the report, the briefing. Where would you send them?
I would go to www.ridenbaugh.com. That's RIDENBAUGH.
You can disregard the panicky email I sent you about the telephone number because I did find it. All right. We'll talk to you next week.
We'll talk to you then.
Thank you very much. Randy Staples joining us this morning, Idaho Weekly Briefing, giving us just a rundown on some of the things. It's if you're looking for detail on what's going on around the state of Idaho, and as well as he pointed out the Northwest, he has a massive publication. You've got to take a look at it. That's why I asked if he had other people working with him, because it truly must be a labor of love to put all that effort into that. 8:58:25 at our studios. You're listening to Bill Colley on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. You can hear us anywhere around the world on the web. Coming up in the next hour, latter part of the next hour, Chris Anderson will join us. We'll get to talk a little bit about skies and the stars. Kind of a nice break once in a while to be able to do that and dream just a little bit. In the meantime, Fox News straight ahead at 9 o'clock. And again, Mr. Big Voice is taking the day off. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Thanks for joining us again on this Monday morning. Temperature only 25 right now, but looking like we're going to have a day. According to one forecast I saw, we're looking at 50. But I also saw another forecast that said we're looking at 39. But still plenty of sunshine today, and by the end of the week, we could be looking at temperatures in the low 60s and going into the weekend as well. We have a guest coming up with us in about 10 minutes. He's going to be talking about issues related to the skies and the planets and other extraterrestrial events that may be going on. That'll be Chris Anderson from the Herod Center on his way to our studio shortly. In the meantime, coming up on 7 minutes after 9 o'clock, I happen to see a couple of things that I thought worth commentary today, only because it just shows you how wacky political correctness has gotten in this country, and perhaps there is no way to ever bring us back to a more traditional approach to our lives. Maybe it's the end of Judeo-Christian culture and the Western civilization. I don't know. I hope not. But I saw a couple of stories over the weekend that made me more than a little concerned. Washington Post. In this story, I read the comments section too, and you know most of the people reading that newspaper, sometimes known as Pravda on the Potomac, happen to come from a rather left-wing worldview. Here's the headline. South Carolina College denounces homosexuality after 2 volleyball players come out as gay, which is a euphemism for homosexuality. Surprised they use that word, because in the New York Times they won't even use homosexual or homosexuality any longer, claiming that that's hurtful, even though it's a scientific term. The Orwellian use of language continues on the American left. Melissa Payne is the writer of the story, or Marissa Payne. She says, in response to 2 male athletes on its volleyball team coming out in an article published on Outsports.com last year, the college, and this is Erskine College in a place called Due West, South Carolina, which is aligned with the Associated Reformed Presbyterian tradition. That is not Presbyterian Church USA, which is a fairly liberal and bland branch of Christianity. Presbyterian Church in America, which is the Reform branch, is a much more conservative branch of Presbyterianism. In a strongly worded denouncement of homosexuality on campus that many read to be a behavioral ban. Now, when you go to a Christian school, do you not expect that there are going to be certain rules that you would be asked to follow? There was a young man many, many years ago. He ended up going to a college, Kentucky, I guess it was, and it was a Baptist college, and he, in the paperwork that he had to fill out and sign, a contract, it said, we do not prevent students who have alternative lifestyles from attending our college, but while you're here, you will not promote those alternative lifestyles. He signed the contract. A week into the semester, he showed up, put a soapbox down in the middle of the quad, got up and started denouncing the school's policy and announcing to everyone who would hear him that he was of that particular persuasion, sexual persuasion, that the school said was not biblical. And then he sued the school after his expulsion, even though he had signed a contract that said that he would not become a spokesman for the cause publicly while on campus. And something called Kentucky Freedom Alliance got behind him, and it got really out of hand. Here you go again. You've got a Christian college which teaches that the Bible is inerrant, that it is the Word of God, and yet they are being pressured, according to this story, to make changes, to be more inclusive. You wouldn't do that at a Muslim school, would you? No, they'd be afraid to even make those demands. The writer says, it is unclear how the newly adopted statement will affect student life going forward. It's a lazy throwaway line. Of course it's unclear. But most of the students who go there probably don't give a hoot one way or the other. They just want an education, or they take their Bible seriously. And here's a quote from one of the students who came out, supposedly, of the closet. I understand the religious stand on adultery, which is part of the 10 Commandments in the Bible, and that would apply to heterosexual and homosexual people. But when I saw the mention of sexual orientation being an issue, it just made me sad. Apparently making somebody sad in America any longer is a crime. Kid, take yourself a Valium, go find another college where you'll be more welcomed and you can move on with your life. For crying out loud. So your feelings are hurt? You knew going into this situation, it is a strict Christian college. What were you thinking? Nobody is here forcing you to change your lifestyle. Nobody here is kicking down your door and hauling you away on a sodomy charge and locking you in a dungeon. Nobody is throwing you off the top of a minaret. Will you shut up and find another place to get an education? 9:12. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story 26 at our studios. You can reach our program at 736-0300. That is 736-0300. And, of course, you can hear us anywhere on the web, all around the world at newsradio1310.com. And speaking of the web, you can send me electronic communication, an email at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. That's bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. Many of these so-called Christian schools have just simply dropped their Christian identity. Nazareth College, which had been a Roman Catholic school in Rochester, New York, couldn't any longer abide by the church's teaching, still call themselves Nazareth College, but they tore away from the Roman Church. We have another school, this one in New England, called Wesleyan University. Now, with the name Wesleyan University, you might get the idea that this college was founded to adhere to the principles of John Wesley, the founder of the Wesleyan faith. But you would be wrong. They no longer as well follow the Wesleyan faith whatsoever. They still keep the name, but the liberals who run the college long ago decided that Christianity was outdated, outmoded, and there was no need for it any longer, because who actually believes in the judgment of God if you don't believe in God? And if you're a leftist academic, you likely don't. So this story came from the Daily Caller. Wesleyan University's gender open house is an angry idea. Writer by the name of Patrick Howley. A liberal arts college in Connecticut is making history by running a shared student residential house for members, get this, of 14 gender categories, and it sounds like a really angry idea. I'm going to jump down here just a little bit. They had an open house too, we should point out. I'm going to jump down just a little bit. Here's a quote, and I'm reading you from the quote, so all of you liberal bloggers out there who hear this and you run off and start writing that I said all of these things on the air, you've got to remember the context, and I will have a record of it myself on this end. This is the quote from the college, from the website, and I'm going to read it to you. Open House is a safe space for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, queer, questioning, flexual, asexual, gender, beep, I can't finish that one. It's a bad word. Polygamous, bondage, disciple, dominance, submission, sadism, masochism communities, and for people of sexually or gender dissident communities. That's on the website of Wesleyan University. And I'm reminded of a story a friend of mine told me years ago. He now is working as a publisher of one of the largest conservative websites in the country, but at the time he was with the Young Americans Foundation, and he was telling me that at Princeton University about 10 years ago, they were teaching courses in 16th century cross-dressing, trying to graduate 60,000 engineers every year, and we're running around doing this. I thought you went to college to get an education so you could get a job, pay your bills, and become a responsible citizen. But apparently that's no longer the case. And here's the acronym that they use on the website when they're appealing to all of these different groups. LGBTQQFAGPBDSM. And that's actually on the website so they can describe all of these 14 differences. And the writer says, look at the ordering of those letters closely. He says, I'm surprised the FCC isn't already blacking it out because, yes, there is a 3-letter combination there that would be considered somewhat of a slur. Apparently, nobody at the website being run by Wesleyan University has caught on to that. He said there are going to be some difficulties, though, because he said you'll be having arguments, apparently, in housing between transgender and transsexual. Also, he says between the group that are identified on the website as queer versus polite conversation, asexual versus everybody else. Then the naughty word, the gender. I looked this up online this morning, and if you drop the F word at the end of it, it says gender bender, whatever gender bender means. Here's another one, dominance, submission versus feminism. And he says, isn't dominance, submission just straight sex? Now, there's an interesting question. Here's another one, bondage, disciple, sadism, masochism. He said, that's a lot of weaponry in one house. And so we have a university once devoted to faith, now devoted, of course, to apparently nothing but sex, which, whether or not you enjoy it, is irrelevant, I think, at this point. The commentary I'm trying to make is, what is the whole point of going to college and getting an education for? So you can learn something, and you can be productive, and yet we have to deal with all of this. 16 minutes now after 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Telephone number 736-0300. You have to keep in mind a couple of quick things here, and I'll bring this up. This is all taking place east of the Mississippi River. And maybe there's at least a buffer between us, between a place like Idaho, or if you're listening in Nevada or Utah, there is a buffer of several states in between, and most of those states are fairly logical places. I don't think that Nebraska and Iowa and some of the other places between here and there are going to be turning around, joining that side, coming and attacking us and forcing us to live that particular way. But you never know. There are people out there whose feelings are going to be hurt if you don't appease them. No different than when you go to prisons any longer and you have to have foods that are set aside for all of the different dietary requirements of the prisoners. They went out and they, kill a family of 5, and then they get locked up, and then they demand that they have to follow strict guidelines because of their religion, which didn't stop them from killing 5 people, but you can't have pork. I don't quite understand all of that. Look, we have a guest coming up. He'll be joining us in just a moment or so. And we're going to be talking about issues related to, astronomy and any number of things, science and the like. That's on the way in just a few minutes. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And again, if you'd like to drop me a line, commentary on anything that we're talking about today, please feel free to do so. My email address, bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. I know that's really, really long. I was going to get a business card made, and then it turned out it was the length of a bumper sticker. So I'm trying to figure out some other way to do all of this. But you can drop me a line, and the last name is spelled Colley. Once more, that is bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. Chris Anderson will be joining us in just a few seconds on the air. In fact, he's patiently waiting to join us right now as we speak. And we're going to lighten things up here a bit. Well, if you can call science light. I think in some places, though, at least the conversation is a little more palatable or palatable, depending what your pronunciation is for most people who might be tuning in. So that's coming up in just a short while. And of course, tomorrow we'll be joined in studio as well by our good friend from the Twin Falls County Republican Party, Steve Millington. And that should keep everybody wide awake. Believe me, Steve is he's naturally caffeinated. All those things coming up. We have a guest joining us in the studio, and he's going to be talking to us about some events that are taking place. First of all, Chris Anderson, it's called Harrod Center, right?
It is.
And I should probably beef up that microphone again.
Well, I could try to shout from here, but
yeah, it might actually work. The acoustics in this place, too. You could do it from outside the door. But you have a lot going on, and of course, you drop by once a month to brief us.
Yep, and it's a big month coming up. So first thing I got to talk about is the Explore Harrod Science Camp, and of course, this is something we've been doing every year for years. It's for kids ages, 3rd through 5th grade ages, and it's an opportunity for the kids to spend the night at the museum, and they get to do 2 science classes, which are very hands-on, interactive type things. They got movie, they get other hands-on activities, they get snacks. I mean, it's really a great time for these kids. And the thing I want to point out, this is Friday, March 13th is the night. And parents, if you want your kid to be participating in this, the registration deadline is Tuesday, March 10th, and I can guarantee you it will fill up. So don't wait until the last minute if you want to get registered for that. So you can go to our website. There's a registration form you can download, print it, and send it in to us. You can also call the Harrod Center's main line. Of course, we're closed to the public on Mondays, but so later in the week, 732-6655, you can get registered that way as well. But yeah, I mean, it's a great fun thing for
We're
kids.
making you come in on your day off then.
Well, actually, no. Even though we're closed to the public on Mondays, I still work on Mondays. That's our day to roll up our sleeves and get dirty when we don't have to look nice for the public. So.
A bit like the life of a clergyman. There's no time off really. You just
Yeah,
keep
pretty
working.
much.
When you mentioned this event, now if I was 14 years old and thinking back to when I was, I would have been thrilled to spend the night in a museum like that.
Yeah, it's a little older than our age group, though. We're looking, like I say, ages 3rd through 5th grade, so we're talking, 9 to 11 years old. But,
Even more so, I think.
Oh yeah, and those kids, that's a great age. They are just, their minds are like sponges. They want to absorb all the knowledge they possibly can, and we're happy to give it to them. And it's such fun things they get to choose from all these different classes of all branches of science, everything from biology, animal husbandry, even. I mean, science, physics, astronomy, you name it. So it's a really chemistry. It's great fun. So.
I'll tell you what. When I was in college, there was a biology professor, and everyone wanted to take his course because he was such an entertainer.
Yep.
And he could, and it's a skill some people have, and it was rare to see people flocking to try to get into that course or his courses.
Yep.
For that very reason. But he turned a lot of people on to biology that way.
Believe me, I teach physics at the college, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that for many of these students, my class is the last science class they might ever take. And so that's, there's a big pressure there. It's like, if this is the last formal science instruction they're ever going to receive, you better get it right, and you better make sure that they leave the class feeling good about science so that they're going to be receptive to it. Because let's face it, we live in a scientific, technological society. We're voters that vote on issues of science and technology all the time. If you kind of back away from science and say, oh, that stuff doesn't interest me, you're backing away from your responsibility as a voter to really decide important issues that are going to affect us all. We've got INEL up the road that stores nuclear waste up there, and is that a concern? I'm not going to tell you one way or the other. You should educate yourself and find out what the issues are and vote accordingly. So, yeah.
And just things like the space program, which
Absolutely.
is somewhat dormant at the moment, but for those of us who grew up on it, it was exciting stuff. But public input is needed on the future of these things.
Absolutely. And I hate to say it, but when you see these polls they'll often take of some of our legislators, a lot of them are just kind of shockingly ignorant about science, and that's a bad deal when we live in a technological age. They're passing laws based on our technology, and yet a lot of them don't have a clue about technology. So
there are a lot of scientists who actually get elected to office, though.
Not very many, no.
Yes, mainly lawyers and occasionally a doctor.
Exactly right. Yeah.
A medical doctor usually, and not a lot of PhDs.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, but there's a lot of doctors that aren't necessarily steeped in science either. So I mean, it sounds kind of strange to think of it that way, but a lot of the skill set necessary to be a doctor is not necessarily the same skill set to be a scientist. So.
Yeah, anatomy and beyond that, that's all you really probably, once you're done with your studies, It's not like every 5 years you have to go be recertified most places, is it?
You're all right. Now, of course, the good doctors are the ones who do try to keep up with the latest developments in medical research and all that. But yeah, I've met some doctors over the years that say, oh, I did terribly in science in school, and I was just kind of really.
Well, on that note, in the next half hour too, if we get some time, I want to talk to you a little bit about the passing of Leonard Nimoy, because if you talk about people who actually, through their work, maybe even not intentionally so, promoted science.
Oh yeah.
There was an individual who fired the imagination of a lot of people. And,
Absolutely.
over the weekend, I just could not believe the tributes and the people writing about the impact he had.
Oh, I'm one of them. I mean, for sure. As a kid, that was, that whole idea that you make decisions based on the available evidence. The philosophy of science, if you will, that was probably my very first exposure to it as a kid, was seeing, Mr. Spock on Star Trek talking about, here's what the data says, here's what we can observe, and here's the conclusions logically derived from those observations. So.
And they, in fact, I know this from reading about the second series, The Next Generation, they would literally hire science advisors to help them with the scripts.
Oh, yeah.
So that they would be accurate.
Yep.
Which, otherwise it was just pure fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
But what they talked about was potentially these are things that can, in some cases, have happened.
Yep.
Well, we've got more coming up with Chris Anderson. It's coming up on 9:30, 27 at our studios. And you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And this is Top Story with Bill Colley. Do want to mention I've got a quick point to make before we move on with our guest, Chris Anderson. And I've been telling you in the last few weeks about Western States Bus Services, which is hiring part-time bus drivers right now. Split shifts, 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. Pay $10.75 per hour. You can apply today by telephoning, and that number is 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. And Chris Anderson and I were talking just a few minutes ago. Of course, he has the science background. We were talking about the death last week of Leonard Nimoy, who played most famously Mr. Spock on Star Trek.
Absolutely.
And what I read about him over the weekend was just phenomenal. How many people were inspired to go into science careers because of the character that he played and how much that character was respected.
Yeah, and I think I'm one of those. I mean, just that exposure to what the philosophy of science was, that we draw logical conclusions based on the observables, and we try to leave our emotions out of it. I mean, that's that's the embodiment of Mr. Spock, and it's really the embodiment of what science strives to be. So,
and the thing was, when you were watching the program too, a lot of the things that they would talk about, and we just briefly touched on this, but for instance, in the later episodes of the next series that followed, they talk about something called the Jeffries tube. A lot of these things they reference are named after particular people in science.
Well, in this case, it was actually one of the Jeffries tube. My Star Trek nerd's coming out now. I think he was one of their set designers actually in that case. But yeah, I mean they did reference real science as much as they could, and of course a lot of it was fantasy. It had to be. But one of my personal favorites is when they're talking about the transporter in the Next Generation. One of the big problems with a transporter device of pulling someone apart molecule by molecule and reassembling them is what's called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The fact that you can't know particles' positions and energy states with perfect precision enough to be able to reassemble a person perfectly. So what did they do on Star Trek to get around that? They invented something called the Heisenberg compensator.
Yes.
In other words, we're cheating, we're breaking the laws of physics here, get over it, is basically what that means.
The inspiration that you need from people along the line, though, when you in any career, really. I had inspiration as a broadcaster from a number of people I grew up listening to. And then, oddly enough, Joey Reynolds, who was in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and it was in syndication for years. And it turned out that we'd grown up about 50 miles apart, and we had some mutual friends, and I got to finally meet him. And then we started calling each other on the phone about every few months, and he'd keep me on the phone for 3 hours, giving me advice and telling me stories. But that helped me. There was an excitement that built about it, and it's still with me today. And I think for a lot of people, it's that when you're 6 or 7 years old and you're seeing something like that, the thrill of it all.
Well, sure. In my case, I was growing up in rural, northern Illinois. How many opportunities was I going to have contact with a real scientist? Not very many. And yet, every week here was Mr. Spock on TV and sort of demonstrating what a real scientist was. So it was, that was sort of my exposure, as close as I was going to come to a real science in rural Illinois. So.
Yeah, and he didn't go around punching people or doing those things either. He's a very calm guy.
No, in fact, I mean, you may have read that Nimoy was the one who came up with the idea of the Vulcan neck pinch, because he thought it's illogical to be violent, right? So he thought, well, shouldn't this cerebral character have a way of disabling opponents that doesn't harm them without coming down to fisticuffs, right? And so they basically rewrote the part so he would have this ability based on his input. So Nimoy went a long ways towards shaping that character, and all the script writers from back there will tell you that. So
and really the series too as well.
Absolutely,
what I understand. Well, you have a lot more going on. We have another segment too coming up, and just a couple of minutes left in this one. You have a lot of things you wanted to discuss too as well today.
Absolutely, yep. In fact, we got our monthly free star party. Of course, those are always on the second Saturday of the month. That'll be on Saturday, March 14th. There's a lot in the sky right now. If you've been watching over towards the western sky, brilliant Venus out there. In the eastern sky, you got Jupiter. That's just the tip of the iceberg, though. There's many star clusters and the beautiful Great Orion Nebula and all sorts of great stuff up there. That event starts at 8:15 in the evening on March 14th, goes till midnight. As long as the skies are clear, you can come for as much of that time as you like. Just be sure you dress warmly, because we don't heat the observatory to want to look through heat waves. We also have a Herritt Forum lecture coming up, and this one is also coincidentally astronomy related. It's by Joe Dodds and Ralph Peterson, two of our local teachers who got to fly on board a high altitude astronomy aircraft. And actually, they've got another mission coming up very shortly here. So they're going to be fresh off that mission to give their talk on Wednesday night, March 18th. That'll start at 7:30. It'll be all about what the Sophia aircraft is all about. It's got a 100-inch telescope mounted on its fuselage, and they got to fly along with it. And so that should be really fun, and that's free. Can't beat that. And then the following night, March 19th, I'll be giving a talk about Einstein's general relativity, which is 100 years old this year. And you might think, oh, that sounds like some pretty esoteric stuff. Well, yes and no. I would make the argument that general relativity saves lives every single day of the week. And if you'll have to come to the talk to find out what I mean by that. But there are certain technologies that we have today that wouldn't work without our knowledge of general relativity. And one of those is a life-saving technology. So, and that'll be, again, Thursday, March 19th, starts at 7:45. There is a fee for that. It's $250 per person. And we'll also have the observatory open afterwards for anyone who wants to look up in the skies. So,
in the next segment, we're coming up against a break here in a few seconds. But I've got to ask you, speaking of things in the sky, some of the space junk.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And we're not the only part of the country that has had that issue in the last couple of weeks.
Yep.
And my sister from Western New York telling me that they had an issue just about 3 or 4 days before it happened here.
Yeah, I read about that.
We've got more coming up with Chris Anderson. It's almost 9:40, 28 right now at our studios. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, and as well anywhere around the world on newsradio1310.com. We're having a discussion probably sometimes the off-air discussions are even better than what we talk about on air. Chris Anderson joining me, Bill Colley, on Top Story this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com on the web. And 28 right now at our studios, coming up on 9:44. We were having a discussion. Only got about 5 minutes left, but that night that we saw that space junk coming down through the sky.
Right, last Monday night.
And Brad from down the hall here happened to also get a photograph hours earlier of something in the sky, but as you were pointing out, two apparently distinct things, no relation.
Would have had to be two different things for several reasons. One being that the Chinese space rocket body, it was going around the Earth every 87 minutes. Well, once around the Earth every 87 minutes. In the meantime, the Earth is rotating underneath it. So if it's going to pass over Idaho on one orbit, it is not going to pass over Idaho in the next orbit or the next orbit or the next orbit. So that right there tells you that it really could not have been the same thing, just being a matter of a few hours earlier. It wouldn't have been going over this part of the Earth, plain and simple.
So many people saw the rocket as it broke apart, though, because just how long it took it to cross the sky over such a big area.
Sure, and plus it was right over the top of us. In fact, there was a fellow who went and looked at all the National Weather Service's radar echoes from the time of the reentry and was able to track exactly where the debris went, and he thinks he's got a pretty good idea where people should be searching on the ground. It's basically western Montana, where he thinks any debris that would have survived the trip would have landed on the ground. So if people want to go looking for bits of Chinese rocket junk, they can do it now.
and a lot of it would have burned up, obviously, before it reached Earth.
Yeah, you figure a rocket body is mostly empty space, right? It's a big fuel tank with engines on it. And so as it's coming back in, it's a pretty fragile thing as it starts slamming into the atmosphere at 17,000 some miles an hour. And probably nothing more than small bits would have survived. The exception possibly being the engines themselves. They tend to be a bit more robust. So, that's probably the biggest chunk that would have had a chance of surviving. But even then, probably in a very diminished size after the trip through the atmosphere. So.
Things are falling to Earth all the time, though, right?
Oh, yeah. In fact, a lot of the information I got about this particular one came from a website that all they do is track re-entering space debris. And if you go to this site, I mean, you can find stuff that's predicted to come down over the next few days. Just about every week or so, there's another 2 or 3 that are expected to be coming down. So it's some bigger than others, obviously, but yeah, it's not an uncommon thing. What's uncommon is for it to come down over populated areas, just because the Earth's mostly unpopulated, right? You've got the poles, you've got the oceans. When stuff comes down over those, no one ever sees it. So
when we talk about what's floating around up there, we've been doing this for almost 60 years now in space.
Right.
So you have it is a tremendous junkyard up there.
Oh yeah. In fact, this particular organization, the one I just talked about, they track some 14,000 objects up there, but I think it's estimated there are something like twice as many, around 30,000 objects that are over 4 inches in size that are just orbiting around. They're not under any control, and they're eventually going to re-enter. So
nuts and bolts and everything else.
Yeah, exactly. Everything from rocket bodies to little tiny bits of debris. So.
I think it'd be difficult to travel up there with all of that.
Well, the good news is that space is big, and if you're in a completely different altitude above the ground, you don't really have to worry about the stuff that's above you or below you. It pretty much stays in its orbital realm, and you're all right. Now, that being said, the International Space Station does occasionally use its boosters to move itself out of the way of a piece of debris that they're afraid might come a little too close for comfort, and they don't want it to impact and cause damage to the station. So there's a website called heavensabove.com that'll show you when you can find the International Space Station as it goes overhead. And one of the things they just recently added to this was predicting near misses between it and other bits of orbital hardware, so you can go and see when they're having their relative close calls.
And of course, we had 2 days before this event, back in the Eastern Great Lakes, they had a light streak through the sky, but this was much faster.
Yeah, so I don't know whether that would have been, a smaller piece of debris in a faster orbit, or possibly a natural, a meteor coming back in, what's called a bolide, which is just an unusually large, bright meteor. So yeah, that's in fact when the Chinese one was first being reported, people were reporting it as a bolide, and then more and more reports came in and video came in, and it became clear that no, it was moving much too slowly and breaking up into lots of pieces, and then of course they went and tracked the orbit and found out what it was. So.
Of course, I remember when I was a kid and Skylab was falling out of the
Oh yeah.
And people were panicking it was going to land on their heads.
Right. Well, and the problem there, of course, was that there were some big chunks. Specifically, they had a film vault up there. They were still using photographic film, and of course, space is a high radiation environment, so they had to have this vault that would protect the film, and it was basically a lead vault. And so they were worried about that thing surviving the trip through the atmosphere, coming down and landing in a bad place. And of course, it did survive the trip. It landed in near Australia, but luckily Australia is largely unpopulated, and so no one was injured by it. But
maybe some of their deadly snakes. But
yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Well, very quickly, we're wrapping up. But for people who Mike Huckabee's on the way. But for people who are tuning in, can you send them to a website where they can see all of your scheduled events?
You bet. We've got, of course, the main Herrit website, which is just herrit.csi.edu. Herrit is with 2 R's and 2 T's. You can also go to the observatory's website, or you can call the observatory's information line for our upcoming events. They're 732-MOON, and the main phone number for the museum itself is 732-6655.
Chris, I want to thank you for coming by again. We'll see you sometime in a month, but if something big like this rocket happens again, we've got to get together sooner.
Sounds good.
Mike Huckabee is coming up next. The Huckabee Report, brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls, 736-6563. Yeah, I think I've encountered a few Irish blockheads. Usually on March 17th, which a friend of mine who used to be in law enforcement always called amateur night. Of course, he said the same thing about New Year's Eve, and you realize there's not much of a difference between the two events. 9:54, and you're listening, of course, to Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. People are thinking I'm being offensive, I guess, to the Irish when you consider that the ancestry in my family. Colley is an anglicized version of Macaulay, which at one time was called MacKilcooley, from somewhere in the area around County Clare, County Galway, and County Roscommon, or Roscommon, I believe is how it's pronounced there. The Irish have a different way of talking, obviously, than all of us do. And then, of course, having a mother who had ancestry on one side of the family from Scotland and then on the other side of the family from Ireland as well, you can tell that I grew up eating bland food. That's about all you need to know about Gaelic ancestry. 9:55, and we have to mention Rush Limbaugh will be along following news at 10 o'clock from Fox. Sean Hannity had a great time, I guess, at CPAC because he was on stage with Jeb Bush asking the questions as Jeb Bush was being booed the other day. And if you'd like to know more about that experience, tune in and hear Sean this afternoon between 1 and 4 right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And then Glenn Beck will be along following Fox News at 4 o'clock this afternoon right here on this very radio station. Didn't get to it today, but I wanted to mention this because it's in a neighboring state. Remember when Seattle, Washington raised its minimum wage to $15 an hour? And there were people who were sitting on the city council saying that this shouldn't be a problem, costs would not be passed on to customers. One socialist, and an avowed socialist, not making this up, who sits on the council said any additional costs could come out of extravagant profits rather than consumers' pockets. Well, as it turns out, a great many restaurants and shops that have always employed people on the unskilled end of the scale or in entry-level jobs are now closing up and closing doors. One of the most popular restaurants in Seattle they used to have music. You could go in and you could listen to a piano player while you had your dinner. The piano and the piano player are gone. They're no longer serving lunch, only dinner, and they may not long be able to continue to do that. Why? Paying help $15 an hour. So they don't even have a restaurant wage where you have in many states because the staff is tipped. So you'll have a restaurant wage, which is often lower than, let's say, the other wage for that very reason. But here you go again. You've got people who make these decisions who have no experience in business. And they'd like to spread that throughout the state of Washington, and then they'd like to eventually take it nationwide. Why have it 15? Why not 50 or 500? We can always just print up more money, right? Make everybody feel better about themselves in that particular situation. If you'd like to know more about this story, if you're in business on your own and you'd like to have a record of this, you can go do a computer search. Fellow by the name of Bill Chandler was the writer of this story, and I happened to find it at something called Viral Buzz. So you can look it up yourself and get all of the nasty details on all of that. Here you go again. You've got people in government who are absolutely clueless about how business works, and then they're making the laws. 9:58. Bill Colley with you. Thank you for joining me today on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as our website, newsradio1310.com, where you can hear us anywhere all over the world, as I like to tell you. And God willing, and the creek don't rise, I am back in this chair tomorrow morning, starting at 8 o'clock.